Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Thanks for joining me. Well, I think I've shared with you in the past that one of my roles is that I'm a counselor educator in the professional counseling program at Middle Tennessee State University. And I have the privilege of teaching interns who are in the final phases of their training program. And of course, when you work with students in the helping profession, and this is true of any of the helping professions, there are a lot of trials and tribulations that they go through in learning this counseling thing, because it's truly an art form, and it can be a very frustrating experience along the way. Well, as I was talking to my interns this week and listening to them talk about their struggles, I was thinking to myself, you know what? This would make a great mental health tip of the day, what I'm about to tell you, because what I did with them is what I often do with students who have these kind of struggles to help them deal with it. And really, it's just a great technique for anyone to use. And the technique is called cognitive reframing. And essentially, it's just looking at things from a different point of view, from a different angle, and oftentimes trying to look at something in a more positive way. So perhaps looking at a problem as an opportunity, looking at a weakness as perhaps a strength, or maybe something that's you think is impossible as a distant possibility. So these are all ways of kind of looking at things from a different angle. In the case of my students, they were upset because they said things or did things with their clients that didn't go over so well, and of course they want to be helpful. And so my take on that was, well, those things happen, but did you learn something from these experiences? And in both cases, I have two interns in this class. They said, well, yes, we did learn, and we talked about the things that they learned. And so the fact that they learned something meant that something positive came out of that, which they can then use with other clients in the future. So my tip for the day, the mental health tip for the day, is to look back at yourselves, whether you're graduate students or you're just a layperson listening to this podcast. Look at what happened over the past week. Try to identify something that happened that was kind of negative or didn't go the way that you wanted it to, and try to look at that from a different angle and from a more positive viewpoint. What's the flip side? You probably looked at it in a certain way, maybe in a negative way, but what's the possible flip side of the coin? How else might you be able to look at that? And what the research shows is that when people can look at things, when they're more flexible and can look at things from different angles like this, they're less likely to be bothered and to experience mental health problems. So that's my mental health tip for today. Well, my guest this week is Barbara Sanders. Barbara is a licensed clinical social worker in Nashville, Tennessee. She's been in the field for a while. And she works with individuals, couples, and families. So without further ado, here is Barbara. Hi again, and welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm your host, Chris Quarto. Well, it's the end of August here in Middle Tennessee, and believe it or not, we're getting some bearable weather today. I think we're in the low 80s, blue skies, low humidity. You really can't ask for more than that. I mean, I love summer, but I think I'm ready for cooler temperatures and Friday night football games. Well, my guest today is Barbara Sanders, who's a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Nashville, Tennessee. And welcome to the podcast, Barbara.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and perhaps you could share with the mental note takers a little bit more about who you are and what types of services that you offer.
Okay. As you said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm a psychotherapist primarily, and all that means is a counselor.
Okay.
I see individuals, couples, and families in my practice, and I work with people from middle to late teens all the way up to the elderly, and with death and dying as well.
Okay. How long have you been in the field, Barbara?
I've been a social worker for 34 years.
Okay.
And I've been in my private practice 25 of those years. I worked in mental health agencies, Oasis Center, family service agencies, and juvenile court before that.
Okay, so you've got a lot of experience under your belt then.
I think I might be old. Yes.
Not too
Right.
old, though. Well, I'm always interested. I ask my guests when they're on here, why did they go into the helping profession? I know there's so many different reasons, and it's so fascinating to listen to people's stories. So maybe you could share a little bit about what motivated you to go into this field. What's your story?
Okay, well, my story is I graduated with a BA in honors in English from the University of the South at Sewanee, Tennessee, in the mid-'70s. And I didn't know what people did as careers besides banker, lawyer, teacher, doctor, or minister.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went straight to English graduate school, actually, and realized very quickly that was not a good idea for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a summer job interviewing mental health agencies and community agencies for a resource book, and I realized I really liked talking with people and hearing about things, and that I'd sort of done that all my life. And then I met a woman who worked in an alcohol and drug facility in Mobile, Alabama, and I thought, wow, what she does sounds pretty neat. I hadn't known any therapists prior to that time, so I had no idea what social work or being a therapist was until then.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I went to graduate school at University of Tennessee and got my master's in social work.
It's always interesting because you hear people who have similar stories to you where in either their undergraduate degrees or their first master's degrees, they really hadn't thought a lot about the helping profession, but then something happens that kind of steers them in that direction. But the question I have for you is, even before you got into social work school, did you know just about yourself, maybe about your personality, that you had that helping spirit, that you just kind of liked to be a helper, or, that type of person?
That's interesting. I wouldn't say I was conscious of it. I think what I watched, though, my dad was an Episcopalian minister, and I watched him not only do that job, but he was a counselor as well. And I would hear him tell stories about helping people, and he was my role model. And so I think I just naturally learned some of what that was through him, but I decided to do it in a secular way and not in a religious organization, even though I think therapy is very spiritual too.
Right. Had you ever thought about going more into that religious direction? I mean, given that background of yours, had you ever thought about that, or what made you decide to go the secular route as opposed to maybe more of the religious route?
I was a college student, and college students tend to turn away from the church they were born into, right?
There's a lot of truth in that.
I wasn't a church attender at that point, and didn't consider it, though I was really interested in comparative religions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you've got 34 years of experience doing this type of work, and you've worked with a lot of different people. It sounds like you said that you've worked with teens and adults and people later on in life, and with all that experience, you've heard a lot of their stories, and I wonder if after listening to their stories, if you find that there are some commonalities that people have in the problems that they present to you, or what's your take on why people have the problems that they do?
I think there are lots of reasons people experience problems, and the first part of that is, I think, as we grow up in this world as children, babies and children, we are very dependent on family members, and it's very easy to have a breach of connection and attachment early on. And then growing up, life is hard, going to school. Some people are loaded with genetics for anxiety or depression, and bipolar, all sorts of illnesses sort of float through some of the families. And so just growing up is hard to do, because this is not an easy world to get healthy in unless you have really good parents, a really good school system, and good people surrounding you. So many people don't have that, unfortunately, and have been raised, even in wealthy families, somewhat neglected, somewhat abused. And I don't mean terrible physical or sexual abuse, but it can be tones of voice, parents not paying attention to their children. All sorts of things leave us with this low self-esteem where most people don't feel very good about themselves, and most people don't think they measure up, and they're seeking something, mostly love, I think, and seeking that in relationships. And unfortunately, in relationships, we're dealing with human beings who also have issues.
That's very true.
Yeah, all sorts of things can happen along the way. And some people, as they get strong because of what's happened to them, and some still have some issues to deal with.
Yeah. So really, what I hear you saying is that it's when you look at all these problems that people have, it's a very multifaceted type of deal, isn't it? That, you look at the thing you mentioned, just looking at a person's development, their early development, how some of those early experiences can play such a critical role as they grow and develop. And then you mentioned genetics, that it's very possible that if a person perhaps had a parent who had some sort of problem, whether it was depression or anxiety, may be more vulnerable, I suppose, to that type of problem as they grow and develop. And then even the environmental explanations for what you were just mentioning there, the families that they grow up in, what happens within those families. So I guess it's really multifaceted, isn't it?
Yes, and I would say also that people shouldn't give up hope, though. They may be born into the worst family in the world, and there is hope of getting better, getting healthier, and thriving. So I want people to know that there's help out there, and they can get that kind of help. Or there are other ways to get help, too, all sorts of ways.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, because I'm sure you've worked with some clients who have gone through some pretty horrific experiences, whether as a child, as a teen, or as an adult. And they have this resilience. They're able to bounce back from those experiences. And it's just a really interesting thing to see how some people have that, some people don't. But for the people who have that, even though they've gone through those really bad experiences, they seem to have something about them that makes them resilient and to really deal with those experiences in a positive way.
Right, they've had to deal with some pretty bad things in their lives and survive it, number one, and thrive within it. And so they have built different kinds of strengths than people who don't have that kind of trauma or neglect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of relates to this whole, I call it a recipe for success. As therapists, we all deal with clients who have different types of problems, and we kind of have our ways of helping people and see things that work and maybe things that don't work so well. But with people that you've worked with, and especially people who you've had a lot of success with, what's your recipe for success, Barbara? What is it that you do, or the way that you work with people, that seems to really help them get from the point where they're really struggling when they first see you to really having that positive quality or being able to cope much better by the time that they're done with you in therapy?
Another good question. I like the word that you used, recipe, because one of the things I tell people is there is no real recipe. And people want that. They want tangible, what can I do to make myself healthier?
Yes.
And there's a lot that goes on in therapy that sounds kind of intangible and vague, but what's important is just having someone to talk to. You get the support and the attention perhaps you've never had from anyone, and the attention and support by someone who has no need of you for anything. It's not a family member or a friend who has motivations of their own, someone you can just say anything and everything to, who, and this is where I find success, who won't judge you or shame you or make you feel bad about yourself, but will in fact what I do is help people explore how they're feeling and what's happened to them and try to make sense of it so that they can see, hey, you might have developed this rage that you have inside because bad things happen to you. It's, again, not that simple, but that's a reasonable, normal reaction to a bad situation. It's not that you're crazy. It's that you've had something terrible happen to you, and you're reacting as a normal person would, which is having big feelings of whatever sort.
Yeah. Mental note takers, I want you to listen to what Barbara's saying here, because some of you may have been in these situations in the past where nobody has listened to you and you had no one to turn to, perhaps as a child or as a teenager or even now. And to have somebody like Barbara who will sit down and listen to you and do this exploring with you, I think it's a real phenomenal thing, a real phenomenal experience that we really sometimes we just kind of take for granted. But going through this situation of being a client and having somebody truly listen to you, truly care about you, it's a real phenomenal type of experience. And Barbara, what I think I hear you saying is that there's really no recipe, is there? There's no formula to this. It's really a lot of listening, exploring, and almost perhaps going where the client wants to go.
Right, and one thing we don't do as therapists is we aren't usually very directive, but we are facilitative, which is we want to help you with whatever your issues are. We don't set the agenda. We listen to what's bothering you, what's distressing you, and then we do follow, but we also guide. So we don't just sit there like the old therapist in the New Yorker in the past and not say anything. We're involved, we're engaged, and as Chris said, we care about our clients. And that's helpful too, because we're in a safe place. Everything that you say to me or a therapist is confidential unless you decide to share it or unless you want us to share it. So it's really a beautiful sort of vessel for your health and well-being and growth to have that kind of space.
And this a client may never have had this experience before. This may be the first time that anybody has ever shown that they care about them. And it's just really amazing to see the reactions of some clients. I've had clients who have just cried because this is really the first time that somebody has truly cared about them and really listened to them. So it's really a powerful experience. And I've said before in other podcasts that I really feel like it's a privilege for me to be a psychologist, to be in that position to help people who are so vulnerable, who are placing their trust in you or me as a psychologist, you as a psychotherapist, Barbara, and it's really an awesome experience and a humbling experience to be a therapist.
Right. I would go so far as to call it sacred. It is sacred that we can do that. And clients or people who are interested in counseling need to know that we therapists, or at least most of us, have done lots of therapy ourselves. So we may not have experienced exactly what one's trauma has been, but we know what it's like to be a client and how important it is and how powerful the situation is too.
Right. Well, how about clients that you've seen maybe who aren't as ready or willing or wanting the help? I suppose that a lot of the clients you get are people who really are seeking that. But I think there are even some people who are seeking counseling when they start in. Maybe they don't expect how intense it's going to be or what it's all about, and so they kind of put on the brakes, and it can be a difficult type of experience. So maybe you can share some of your experiences that you've had working with more difficult clients.
Okay, well, I think one thing that happens when people come to therapy is usually they're in some great distress, or someone else has brought them there, like a spouse, a partner, or a parent. And sometimes those people have a hard time going to therapy because they really don't want to be there. That wasn't their idea.
Right.
But as you say, many people go into therapy because they know something's bothering them, something's wrong about their lives, and they want to change or have change happen. But once they start looking at their lives and inside themselves, it can be a pretty scary, vulnerable place. And that's why we've all developed coping skills and behaviors that we have, some of which don't work very well anymore. But it's scary to get down to the root of why we've developed those behaviors, because there's a lot of pain, sadness, grief, anger, all sorts of things down in there. And some people don't want to face that or can't at that point, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And so I always try to help the person gradually deal with whatever's going on. But change is hard. It's hard for any of us. And so I can see when people decide that's enough for now. And then if they've had a good experience, they'll come back later on when they're ready and when they feel like they have something different to work on, or when they feel more secure and able to.
Yeah. Mental note takers, I think Barbara said something I think is really important for you to take note of. That had to do with coping skills. And I think that as we go through experiences that could be negative, that all of us learn different ways of coping with those experiences. Some coping skills work better than others, but they serve a function. But over the course of time, sometimes those coping mechanisms can cause problems in and of themselves. And I think that's one of the things that will oftentimes bring people to therapy. And those are things that you can work on with your therapist to look at, okay, this is what I'm doing. Maybe I need to be looking at doing something differently. Now, Barbara, when you're working with clients, tell the audience, the mental note takers, what it is how you work with clients that would draw them to you. Why is it that a client, somebody who might be listening to this podcast today, why is it that they might want to come to see you for psychotherapy services?
Okay. One reason is because I am very experienced. I've been through a lot and seen a lot, and you don't have to be worried that what you're going to tell me will freak me out, because I'm pretty tolerant and open about all sorts of things, from sexual issues to family dysfunction to all sorts of things. So you don't have to be afraid that you're going to shock me or be shamed by me.
Okay.
Also, I'm a pretty friendly person by nature, so I like sense of humor. I don't just get serious with people, but we can have some fun as well.
Yeah.
And therapy's not all fun, but we can laugh when things are lighter, and we can plunge into the dark, deep places when we need to. But I think the most important thing is that I really, just by nature, am not that judgmental of a person, and so I don't get real critical or harsh, usually with people, even when they're struggling. And I'm pretty comforting. I'm sort of a maternal figure to some people. If they've had not so great a mother, or their mother died, or whatever, people sometimes see me that way, that I can just be really nurturing and helpful, and I think a sort of calm presence.
Yes. Yeah, and what I heard right there is two things really. The non-judgmental aspect, I think, is critical for a therapist. But the other thing that I liked what I heard you say is that people don't have to feel ashamed when they talk about their issues. And I think in some cases people feel that they've done something, or things have happened to them that they feel very ashamed of, and that they would never want to talk about with anybody for fear of judgment. But what I hear you saying is that that's not an issue with you, that you're non-judgmental, that they can feel comfortable with you talking about anything, because you've been there, done that, you've heard it all.
Right, and what happens with my clients is they're usually judging themselves very harshly. So anything can make them think someone else is judging them. But what I try to help them do, and this may be the most important thing I help people do, is to not be so hard on themselves. Because most people, again, have problems with themselves. They think maybe some of what's happened to them is their fault. And I say, certainly you participated in your life, but a lot of things have happened to you as well. And let's sort out which is which. And you can take charge of the things that you have some control over, and there were things that you didn't. So I really try to help people make sense of it all.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. And, I was in an earlier podcast with Brenda Quinn. She's a psychologist in Murfreesboro. She was talking about how bad things happen to children and how as adults, clients feel so ashamed about what had happened. But Brenda, in her work with clients, shares with them is that how could you have done anything differently as a child? You had no power as a child. This is something that somebody did to you that you had no ability to really deal with in that capacity. There's no real reason for you to feel ashamed about something like that when it happens to you as a child. And I thought that made a lot of sense,
Right.
and that's part of the work, I guess, that goes on in those types of sessions. Well, when you think about just generally for people who may not come into therapy, but just are listening to this podcast and are just kind of looking for general tips or advice to improve their mental health or maybe to improve their relationships, do you have any tips or advice you can give people generally that will help them with their mental wellness or with their relationships?
Yes, and in fact, I was just at a workshop last weekend with Brene Brown, and that's spelled Brene Brown. You can listen to her TEDx talks or TED Talks and read her books, Daring Greatly. She's got a new book out. She is a fabulous author for helping all of us look at our lives, try to be gentle and kind with ourselves, but to look realistically at what we can and can't do. And I think some other tips are to try, when you're watching yourself doing these coping skills that don't work very well anymore, or when people are irritated with you for them, think about, how am I feeling when I'm doing that, or what am I not feeling because I'm doing it?
Right.
And so you might have to deal with those uncomfortable feelings and restrain the behavior to even figure that out. And then that's something to work with, what's going on with you. Then you can figure out maybe if there's some different ways to cope and handle things. And hopefully you can find some relationships with other people who are willing to look at their behavior, because if you're the only one doing the work, sometimes that still doesn't work very well.
That's right. And I think there's a lot to be said about self-reflection, taking a look at yourself, trying to become more self-aware. And with what you just mentioned about those coping skills, and the way I kind of think about that is what's the function of the behavior? And in this case, what's the function of the coping skill? Why is it that I'm resorting to this type of coping skill or this type of behavior when I'm in certain situations? And I think that that's something that people can think about in terms of improving their their mental wellness, or just kind of understanding themselves a little bit better. Well,
right.
Go ahead.
And I say one more quick thing, and that's we all need ways to soothe ourselves, and that's mainly what we try to do when upset. So see if you can play around with some other ways to soothe yourself if one of the ways you're using is not working well.
Yeah, especially self-soothing or methods of soothing yourself that aren't self-destructive is really the big thing.
Absolutely.
Well, how can a client contact you if they're interested in setting up an appointment with you, Barbara?
They can call me at 615-414-2553, or they can email me at Barbara Sanders, and I'll spell that BARBARASANDERS LCSW, which stands for Licensed Clinical Social Worker, at gmail.com, and I'll respond to any voicemail messages or emails that I get.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, Barbara, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Make a Mental Note podcast. You shared a lot of great things that I think that our audience are going to benefit from, and have a great rest of the day. All right, Barbara had a lot of good things to say in that interview. In fact, I'd like to see how much you've learned, since education is key to mental wellness. Here's my question. Sometimes when people experience negative life events, they do something to deal with them. How do they deal with these events? And here's a hint. Sometimes the things that people do don't serve them well in the long run. Well, Barbara mentioned that people develop coping mechanisms or strategies to deal with emotional pain, and sometimes we refer to these as defense mechanisms or survival tactics in the mental health field. And it's important for clients to understand the purpose of the coping mechanisms and determine if they're really hurting them more than helping them. And if so, to learn different ways of dealing with emotional pain and stress. And that's what mental health professionals help clients do. Well, here's my mental note takeaway from this interview with Barbara. Sometimes people don't receive the love and attention they needed early on in life to form a secure attachment with parents. And in other cases, people are abused and neglected. And these experiences not only impact a person's self-esteem in the long run, but also affect how they relate to others as they grow and develop. And so this is where people like Barbara come into play to help clients explore these experiences and find meaning in them and to learn how to grow and develop. Well, thanks again for listening to the Make a Mental Note podcast. We have some great episodes in store for you. And as always, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com, for show notes of this episode. And, if you liked what you heard today, do me a favor and consider writing a 1-sentence review on iTunes. That'll ensure that the podcast will stay on the iTunes playlist so other people can benefit from the content in the future. It's very easy to do. Just go to the iTunes store, itunes.com. Type in Make a Mental Note into the search box, and then just click the ratings and review tab and type away. Just a 1-sentence review. That would be fantastic. Have a great week, everyone.